All right, so this is China Part 3. So this is about citizen society in the state, so about civil society and about participation and about cleavages in China's society. So as usual with this topic, we will start with ethnic cleavages. And I know this was mentioned in the 5th hour presentation, but primarily the ethnic population is Han Chinese. I think the statistic that Jacob gave today was 91%, so right around 91, 92% of the population is Han Chinese. There are some minority ethnic groups that exist. They make up about 8% of the population, so about 100 million citizens. What you need to know, in particular related to ethnic groups, are the ways that the Chinese government has protected some ethnic groups. So, for instance, this was a previously released AP question in 2015. The AP asked, to identify a minority ethnic group that was recognized by the Chinese government and then received special protections. So there are 55, that are recognized. Some of the ones that received special protections, and both of them were mentioned in our 5th hour presentation today, were Tibetans and Uyghurs. So the Chinese government does grant special protections to some groups. For example, the Tibetans, they have been given extended religious freedom, and the reason for that, it's an attempt to prevent unrest. Jacob did a really nice job today talking about some of the terrorist attacks that have been carried out by the Tibetans and by the Uyghurs, and how that has been dealt with in China. So this is just a very brief extension on that. This information here is really just sort of to give you some context. Most minority groups live near borders with other countries. Many of them live in some of those autonomous regions. Remember, China has those areas that are granted a lot of their own control. So this gives you a look at some of those particular ethno-linguistic groups and where they are primarily located. And if you'd like to spend a little more time, looking at that, please feel free. You notice the Han Chinese is this light purple color, and so again, you can see the extent to which most people in China are of this ethnic background. So this was mentioned in the documentary we watched, the cleavage between the urban and rural population. If you remember, in the video, talked about having China A and China B. So this is really a result of economic growth that we've seen since 1979, since Deng Xiaoping was in office and implemented, a lot of change and brought about the growth in the economy and growth in industrialization. So about 52.6% of the population is the urban population. They have higher incomes, higher levels of education. The urbanization is still going on, and again, I know this was another area that was focused on in 5th hour today, this idea that migration is occurring within the country from rural to urban areas. So it's about a 2.3% rate of change in people moving from rural areas to urban areas. In 2011, this was the first time the urban population was greater than the rural population. So that's a major shift throughout most of China's history. The rural population far exceeded the urban population, and the urban areas weren't nearly as extensive as they are now as a result of industrialization. Just some statistics. Oh, and of course this leads to an increasing inequality between the two, especially in terms of education and access to education. The video also, if you remember, talked about how people in the rural areas, they're really lacking some basic necessities. They're lacking access to health care, to clean water in some cases, to school systems. So this is facts. And on the AP test is this idea of political participation in authoritarian systems. And I've asked this on previous tests, how do people get involved, how do people still participate politically in authoritarian systems? So think about that. How are people still, getting involved in politics? Some things you might talk about or think about would be joining political parties or running for office. Now, interestingly enough, in China, it is a one-party system under the Communist Party, but there are actually 8 other parties in China that exist. They simply do not contend with the Communist Party. They're very minor, and they sort of exist to allow people some sort of outlet. So we almost don't have enough time in this class really to get too much into that, but there are other parties that exist. They just don't have a realistic chance at becoming elected. So you can join political parties. You can stand for office, meaning you can join the Communist Party. People can vote, especially at the local level. Those local township councils are directly elected by the people. Now, that is still pretty tightly controlled by the Communist Party. The list of candidates is tightly controlled, and the election itself is tightly controlled, but people are able to choose those members. And then once you're on a village council, you have more of an opportunity to advance within the party itself. Protests and demonstrations, again, so in China we know that this is pretty limited, even just from watching the Tank Man documentary, but this is, a way that this still can exist oftentimes in authoritarian systems. Civil disobedience, so think about Tank Man. I think he's a great example of civil disobedience and someone who is sort of, challenging the state. Civil disobedience is usually, defined as breaking a law and doing so peacefully to show the problems or the hypocrisies in the law. So standing in front of the tanks, we wouldn't say that's illegal, but it's certainly something that the government would frown upon. So that's a great example of a peaceful protest. Sometimes we see things that are not so peaceful, like coups or revolutions or political violence. So that's just a list of things to think about. If you would see something like this, the AP test loves to go back to basics and just ask about generalities, especially when comparing democratic and authoritarian systems. All right, so let's talk about participation in political parties in China. So first, we of course have the Chinese Communist Party and participation. The Chinese Communist Party is the largest political party in the world. However, what may be surprising is that only 8% of the citizens who are 18 and over are actually members. This is not as easy as, checking a box or going and signing up and saying, hey, I'm a Republican or hey, I'm a Democrat, the way it is here. Here you can very easily register with any party. They will welcome you. It's very hard to get into official membership within the Communist Party in China, where classes and training are required in order to become an official member. In 2001, the party expanded to allow capitalists to become members. So again, we have that dichotomy of the capitalist economy with a socialist dictatorship in terms of the political freedoms. The Chinese Communist Party does have a youth league with more than 75 million members. So the purpose here would be, to recruit the next generation of leaders, to promote the party's values in youth. You might say it's about sort of indoctrinating people. So, and making sure that, people believe in the party's message. And then, as I mentioned, the CCP does allow the existence of 8 democratic parties. They're still controlled by the CCP, and they really serve an advisory role. So I think, again, this is kind of about the appearance of having these democratic parties and sort of giving people an opportunity to join these other parties. They're focused on, each of the parties is focused on a particular interest. So, for instance, there's a party that's focused on scientific development. There's a party that's focused on modernization. There's a party that's focused on the Chinese living overseas and their interests. There's one that's, focused on intellectuals. So their job is really, to sort of form an advisory role. All right, elections. So the People's Republic of China does hold elections to provide political legitimacy to both the government and the Chinese Communist Party. As I mentioned, the party does control all of the commissions that run the elections. They approve the list of candidates. And at the local level, the voters do get to choose those deputies to serve on those lower level congresses. So when you think back to the hierarchy of the Chinese government, remember that at the lowest levels, we do have councils for villages and townships, and then for counties, and then for provinces. So the voters get to choose those people. Since the 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party has allowed more than one candidate, so people are actually being given a choice in those local elections. So this is an example of a move toward democracy at that village level because, again, we don't see the leaders being just chosen or handpicked by the party, but instead the people themselves are being allowed to vote. Of course, we need to talk about political participation, and I will repeat here the definition of civil society simply because it makes sense. Remember that civil society are voluntary organizations that people can be part of. And so interest groups are examples of civil society. So we're going to talk about what that looks like in China. Again, as you might imagine, organized interest groups and social movements are not openly permitted unless they are under the authority of the party or the state. Corporatism exists here. Let's just repeat the definition of corporatism. And I'm telling you, if you're taking the AP test, you absolutely have to know what corporatism is. That's going to come up. I've seen it on every released test. So corporatism is when the government, the state, has official relationships with particular interest groups. So it's a formalized relationship with interest groups that they allow to influence them. So the party or the state forms what they call mass organizations. So people within these are allowed to express their views within limits. It's kind of like a labor union that you would see in the United States. A mass organization would be like a labor union. So, for instance, there are some that, revolving around a trade union. Most factory workers belong to the China Federation of Trade Unions. There is a women's federation. So they're allowed to, people can organize around these occupations and around these sort of categories. But again, what they can say is pretty limited. The last point I have on here is that in urban areas, the party maintains much of its social control through something called danwei. And this is a unit or an organization based on a person's workplace. So it's similar to, again, like a party machine in the, early 1900s in the United States. So these are social organizations based on where people work, and they help provide people with their jobs, their promotions, their medical care, their housing. So it's really important for people to join these groups and to be in the good graces of these groups. And again, just to kind of point this out, the party is very much involved. This isn't something that the citizens themselves are organizing or joining. It's party controlled. All right, back to civil society again. So people's ability to join those voluntary organizations. Civil society, remember, does not mean voting. It doesn't mean, promoting a candidate. It means joining an organization. So civil society was really non-existent under Mao. Recently, we've seen a little bit of growth in the existence of private organizations. And when those organizations do not directly challenge the state and they focus on social issues, they have more freedom to do that. Beginning in the 1990s, non-governmental organizations could register with the government, and the government could grant them permission to operate. So we see all kinds of different groups. It says China has thousands, ping pong clubs, environmentalist groups. We're seeing a growth in Christian and Buddhist groups, although the government does keep close control on them, monitors them. The freedom to assemble and speak freely, it doesn't really exist. It's very tightly monitored to make sure that there's no challenge to the authority of the state. I'll very briefly go through this, especially since our policy presentations did a nice job with this. We have seen very few major protests since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Sometimes we will see examples of labor unrest, but typically that occurs at the village level. These aren't things that are getting national attention. And we have seen some protests in autonomous regions. I will focus mostly on Tibet, and this was mentioned in our fifth hour presentation, that they held some riots and some demonstrations in March 2008 around the Olympics, and some debates centered on the Olympics. And as I mentioned, Tibet is a state-recognized group, ethnic group. Tibetans are, and they're allowed some autonomy to sort of try to quell some of those uprisings. Finally, with media, we've been talking about this in class, but just to kind of clear it, most are state-run and controlled. There are some independent media outlets. They they're limited in scope. We have seen some growth in investigative reporting, but it's pretty limited, especially, we don't like to see a lot of, the Chinese government doesn't like to see a lot of investigative reporting related to corruption, although that's an area that many journalists are eager to explore. All these outlets are subject to very heavy censorship by the state. And as we've been talking about, the internet is strictly controlled, and that came up again in both policy presentations. That is the end. I went through that pretty quickly here. Let's go back to that if you need it. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask me or send me an email. But that's kind of our part 3 here. I will look forward to tomorrow when we discuss the policy articles that you have for homework. And if you haven't yet checked out the clip from 60 Minutes, it's about a 12-minute video. Super awesome. You will definitely find it interesting. And I will see you tomorrow. Let's see if I can